All right, what's going on, everybody, and welcome back to the channel. Doing something a little bit different today. Instead of building a PC, we're going to deconstruct a PC. So to be clear, this system has served me well over the last couple of years. This is an 8700K on a Z390 board. It's an Asus Maximus Code 11. With an Asus ROG Strix GTX 1080 Ti. It's under a custom loop. It's inside of the Phanteks Enthoo 719 case. Now, after I'm done taking this all apart, I'll have some final thoughts and things on the actual case and some of the decisions that were made in the build. Don't know if that'll happen tonight. It's a little late as I'm getting started, but I do want to get started on this because there's something I need out of here before I can actually finalize the plans for the new build. I put this thing together about a year and a half, 2 years ago. Don't even remember how long it's been. I think the first loop I did was like 2.5 years ago. Don't really remember the time. Probably should have thought about that first. This was my first real foray though into something like real big, real expansive, real out of control, and it was fun, but there were some hiccups I ran into along the way. And I thought, everybody puts up their builds on YouTube. Everybody talks about how they've built their computers and talks about all that stuff. But I thought, why don't I give everybody kind of a look into what goes into taking something like this apart. Now, when I actually go through to do this, I'm going to be using two different cameras. I actually have my streaming camera configured to record. And when it's time to actually jump into it, I'll have both cameras going at the same time. This way, as I'm moving around to kind of get things in and out, you should be able to have a view of everything. And I think right now my plan is to kind of voice over as I'm taking it apart, talk about the actual build, changes that have been made to it. It's undergone a few different changes. Fans, capture card, coolant has been changed since this original version. Beyond that, the core specs have mostly remained the same. The memory that's in here right now is not the actual memory that I've had for a while, though. I actually took the Trident Z RGB and put it onto the new system to make sure that it was compatible, because AMD can be a little bit funky. But yes, this is ahead of my switch to AMD Ryzen. I'm going to be going ahead and doing it. We're going to be moving into the AMD platform. It's an X570 board, Asus ROG Strix Gaming F. And we're going to start with a 3900X. Wanted to do the 5900X, but a lot of stuff has kind of gotten in the way of those plans. A little bit of health, a little bit of financial. With AMD potentially announcing a new platform here in the coming months, though, might end up working out for the best. A lot of the parts are going to carry over, though. The graphics card's going to carry over, the memory that I was using, a lot of the storage. But we're going to simplify a lot of aspects of it. We're going to be moving it into a Fractal Design Meshify 2 XL that has been custom painted. I'm really excited to show that. Hopefully by the end of the weekend we get to that portion of the build, of the rebuild. But for now, it's about draining the loop, taking as much out of here as possible, getting things cleaned up. I want to take a look at the blocks, see how they turned out. Been using this Mystic Fog fluid for about the last 6 or 7 months. Really curious to see what it's done. And then kind of get everything cleaned up, things that are going to be going into the build. There's some Weonly Uni fans in the top here that are going to be moving over. All the fans except the bottom. I'm putting a couple of fans in the bottom of the Meshify 2 XL to kind of give some underglow, plus somewhere to mount the pump res. I'm going to be reusing the pump res. But we have a new AMD block. We have a updated GPU block. But beyond that, a lot of the core pieces are going to stay the same power supply. We're just going to switch to a different set of custom cables. Don't really need to spend a whole lot of time talking about that. That's for that project and another day. For now, though, we're going to get out as much as possible power supply. Anything that can be removed ahead of time, I'm going to take out before I actually start draining. I do have a drain port in here. We're going to get it connected. We're going to get as much fluid out. The bottom red is going to complicate things just a little bit, but as long as I have most of the pieces out, I can shift the case around a little bit to kind of get the rest of it out. And then once we have the blocks and such out of there, it gets a lot easier as the loop continues to drain. As pieces run out of fluid, you can start to kind of get the radiators and such out of the way, and it makes it a lot easier in the end. So it shouldn't be too bad. I really am just trying to get to the back plate. I want the back plate off of the block because I want to paint that to kind of match the aesthetic that I'm going for. For now though, first steps, gonna go ahead and shut the microphone off. I'm not gonna record audio during this part. And gonna go ahead and start getting this taken apart. It is extremely dusty. This is gonna probably make me sneeze about a half dozen times. So let's get right into it. The deconstruction of this build was thankfully a pretty simple process. It took maybe about an hour to get everything out of there, including all the water cooling, get everything drained out. Some of this was made easier by the fact that I have a drain port built into the pump res. The other part of it, obviously, the use of soft tubing. That always makes things much easier. Soft tubing has saved my existence so many times. All in all, you know, I was pretty happy with how everything came apart. In looking back at some of the footage that I took, I was really pleased with the fact that even though I used that EK Mystic Fog fluid for about 6 months, it really didn't cause any major issues. In fact, if you saw the earlier images in this video, the gunk was pretty minimal on the CPU block. It was just kind of very centered. The jet plate was very minimally covered, and it literally was clean within about, you know, with 5 to 10 minutes of cleaning. It's really all it took to kind of get things clean. And I was really happy to see that. There's so many horror stories about fluids and what they do to systems, and really this fluid didn't do anything. I really think the reason I ran into a problem is because when I decided to switch fluids, I didn't actually clean it properly. So this came apart really well. And it generally wasn't much of a hassle. So really the first step in getting this build taken apart was to get as much out of there as possible. As you saw, I removed as much of the cabling as I could. I got the power supply out of there. I removed as many wires from the front part of the case as I could. And this made the process much easier and less likely to cause any kind of damage. I really just didn't want any liquid dripping down into the power supply. I was pretty confident I was going to be able to do this without dripping anything, but I wanted to be sure 100%. And then as I went along, I drained the loop a little bit and started to pull pieces out little by little. You know, wherever I felt like I was confident that the fluid was settled in an area where if I took the tubing off, it wouldn't cause a crazy leak, I went ahead and took it out. I started with the bottom, loosening the front rad. I then moved on to the bottom rad. Just to kind of get the pump res moving around so I could kind of get a little bit more of the liquid out. And I just kind of systematically went through each section of the loop to try and get liquid out as much as possible. I plugged up ports whatever I could so that there weren't any unnecessary leaks. And it just ended up being a pretty smooth experience. As for the build itself, it evolved. The very first iteration wasn't what I wanted. I realized the radiator issue was going to really annoy me, and I ultimately decided to start looking for a way to resolve that. And the way to resolve that was to switch from the EK Coolstream PE, Discord, to the Coolstream Slim. And that I ended up doing that for both the top radiator, the 360, and the front, the 280. And this eased the space constrictions that I was running into considerably. I got a little creative. Obviously, this build incorporated angled fitting, something that I didn't use when this was in the Evolve X. But the bigger thing here was the fans kept constantly changing. If you followed me on social media, whenever I post a picture of this build, it seemed like I had a new fan in there. And that's because the initial set of fans just didn't do it for me. I started with Noctua Redux 140s in the front. Those were perfectly fine. They had a Halos fan frame on each of them, and those ultimately ended up having issues. The top fans were PC cooler fans. The rear fan was a Phanteks case fan, and that actually made it through the entirety of the build. The bottom fans were EK Vardar fans. The side intake were Antec Prisma fans that I was testing out. When I made the change with the radiators, I picked up a PC cooler fan set that came in a 5-pack. This gave me the use of a remote that allowed me to kind of play around with the colors and other settings. And it was just nice to be able to just click a button to make changes to the colors. Eventually, though, more fans ended up changing as the build went on. The PC cooler fans stayed in there for quite some time, but then Lee & Lee's Uni fans came out. I decided to grab a bunch of those in both black and white at the 120 size. I eventually swapped in a white set on the side intake, the black set on the top exhaust. I switched the front Noctua fans for some Phanteks SK140s. When I took the PC Cooler 5-pack out, I switched the bottom fans to the Fractal Design Prisma fans, and those did a really nice job as well. Why would constantly change the fans like that? Well, I like testing out new things. I like seeing how they look. The Uni fans were always exciting to me because of the cabling solution that they came up with. And frankly, we need more products that are innovative in that way. The Uni fans are really, really unique in how they handle the wiring. The Fractal Design fans, they were really nice as well, but they were really hard to get, much like the Uni fans. It took a while for me to get some in. And the Phanteks fans, I really only bought those because I was curious. Do these have the same issues that other Phanteks digital RGB products have shown? And in the end, they haven't to this point, but they're kind of an outlier along with the LED strips. In fact, pretty much every digital Halos fan frame, aside from my rear 140, has run into some sort of color issue in some capacity. So the build evolved, the build changed, I added stuff in, but for the most part, the core pieces were always the same. There was just usually a shuffling of fans. I did have an issue with the pump. I did run into an issue with the pump res at one point. The solution to that ended up being just kind of switching to the other pump res I had, putting the 250 mil reservoir tube on it and the cap for the quantum kinetic TBE, and just kind of calling it a day. And that worked out pretty well for me in the long run. So that's kind of the deconstruction of this build, and enjoy the last little bits of this footage. And I'll see you in a couple of seconds when I actually wrap this up with my conclusion. All right, so everything is torn down. The core pieces, aside from the power supply, are on the table in front. So we've got motherboard with the CPU still installed, GPU, CPU block, and the SSDs. Everything else is off to the side in a pile over there. And the incredibly dusty case frame is right here. All in all, it really wasn't all that bad to take apart. I think little over an hour to get everything out of the case. No major mishaps along the way. For me, I've really kind of figured out a way to get it out without much of an issue now. I apologize if it wasn't bright enough. I didn't realize until I was about 3/4 of the way through that I really had the ISO way too low for you to be able to really see what I was doing in there. So that's my bad. As far as everything though, everything appears to be in pretty good shape. So this is right here. Let me flip it around for you. The motherboard that I was using for this build, this was the Asus ROG Maximus 11 code. I don't know if you could see the CPU paste really degraded quickly over time. There's a lot of it on the block. In fact, if I pick up the block and show, the CPU block's got a pretty healthy amount of paste still on it. I don't know that the coverage was as great as it could have been. Temps were fine. I never had an issue with temps on this board, so really can't complain too much there. All in all, I don't have too many things that I can complain about with this build in general. The 8700K is still a really solid CPU, particularly if gaming is all you're interested in. Still 6 cores and 12 threads, so it can handle a live stream. It can handle a lot of stuff. It's still a very capable CPU. Obviously, the GTX 1080 Ti is still a great graphics card even a few years later. This thing is still going to continue to carry me over until, you know, I can actually afford and find an RTX series 3000 series card. EK stuff has worked out pretty well for me over the course of time, but I am making a few changes. Instead of a solid block, I'm going to go with a Plexi version on the AMD build. Same thing with the GPU. We're keeping the Quantum Kinetic TBE. The radiators need to be cleaned and need to be changed over. I'm going to go with a dual 360. I have my original 360 millimeter radiator that I wanted to put in the top of this case but couldn't work out. Ultimately had to make the first of many changes over the course of this build. Overall, the Enthoo 719, it's not a bad case. It's really not. I don't think that there's a problem with the case overall, but there are some things that if you don't plan properly for them, that could come and bite you. As some of you may have known, when I was actually setting up this build, I ran into clearance issues with the original radiator I wanted to use. It was too wide, and because they don't have a radiator mount in this case, because they were saving money, it just didn't work. So I had to switch to the slim. So that was the first thing that I ended up changing. Obviously, I've gone through fans. I probably talked that in the section before. There are a lot of fans in this case, but this case can handle it. You've got intake on, you've got bottom intake, side intake, front intake. You have all the space in the world for fans. So airflow was never an issue in this case, and temperatures were never an issue as a result. But there are some design flaws with this case that I think held it back. And some of it is because I was being overly ambitious, and that falls on me. But some of it I think is Phanteks just kind of shortcutting it a little bit. I think this case could have been a little bit wider. That would have helped with cable management in the back. And I think it could have been a little bit taller, and that would have helped with some of the clearance stuff, and maybe would have allowed them to put a radiator mount in the top like they had on the previous cases. But they didn't do that. And ultimately it ended up forcing me to switch to slim radiators. I still think at this point that that's a manufacturing variance thing, because I know other people have been able to fit thicker radiators in the top with fans on the bottom. I couldn't do it. And that's just the end result there. The reality with this case is that Phanteks really wants you to do dual systems in here. That's what this front portion is for. It's for a dual system. As a result, this case really isn't meant for triple rads and mechanical drives to coexist in the same build. And because I still use a mechanical drive, that forced some issues upon my hand. I didn't have 3 cages in there because I had 3 mechanical drives in. I had 3 cages in there because that was how much I needed to get it up before I could actually plug in the SATA power and the SATA data, due to the fact that the I'm blanking. Fittings. The ports for the fittings were on that side. So they didn't fit on that side. They didn't fit unless the power supply cables were out of the way. So that was one of the things that I kind of had to adapt. Obviously, if I wasn't using a mechanical drive, that's not an issue whatsoever. And I could have even easily fit a slim 360 in the bottom if I really wanted to. If I didn't have the bottom radiator, I probably could have done the thicker 360 in the front without much of an issue. But I was being overly ambitious, and that falls on me. That all being said, it's still a good case. The airflow in it is perfectly fine. It's actually much better than I expected. I personally don't have a problem with the front and top panels being plastic. It's actually very high quality. It is really not something that you notice unless you go looking for it. And even then, it still looks pretty damn good to me. The LED strips in the front that runs along the bottom to the side and up through the top is a nice touch. If you can see it, I couldn't, but I knew it was there. They still have this one here, but it was actually kind of overshadowed by the fact that I had a neon strip right above it. Again, this piece here with the CPU, the 8700K and the Maximus 11 code are going to go to my daughter, along with the boot drive that's in here, the NVMe. So the majority of what you see right here is going to be part of her new build, well, updated build. and that's going into a standard size Meshify 2 that is being painted. Still finishing up right now, but should be ready to go by the time I'm ready to actually rebuild this. And the nice thing is this board has Wi-Fi, and because this board has Wi-Fi, we don't have to run an obnoxiously long cable through the walkway into the living room that gets trampled by the dogs on a regular basis. So I'm gonna get some of this stuff cleaned up. I'm gonna start preparing this. I gotta take these backplate pieces off and start swapping them over. I think I have the mounting hardware that for the EK Fluid gaming kit for Intel socket that this CPU sits in, and I can start at least getting that prepared. I got to get this backplate off, which is not that difficult to do, and see if I can pop this EK tab off. I want to paint this to match what I'm doing with the case and a little bit of the motherboard on the X570 board that I'm going to be using. So still a lot to do, but this was step one. I needed to get this out of the build. I needed to get this stuff started, deconstructed. We'll finish this up, and stay tuned for the revised build. I will be doing a video on the new build. My daughter's build will be streamed over on Twitch once I have everything set up. I have pre-set up stuff on the X570 system, but there's still a lot of work that needs to be done. So we'll see how that goes. That's gonna do it though for this video. Have you used the Phanteks Enthoo 719? Have you run into any issues that you thought were a little weird, or maybe you shouldn't have run into? Or was the case perfectly fine for you? Are you still on an older platform? 6th gen, 7th gen Intel, 1st gen Ryzen? Are you planning on upgrading? What kind of things are you looking to do with your system, aside from graphics cards? Because I know those are still really stupid right now. Let me know down in the comments below, and I will see you guys in the next one.